Venezuela, the second day of the International Summit Against Fascism, as part of the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the 2002 coup d'etat, is in progress. President Vladimir Putin has assured that the objectives and tasks of the operation in Ukraine will be achieved and that it was impossible to avoid a confrontation with the anti-Russian forces in that country. At least 45 people have died in floods and mudslides after rainstorms struck the South African port city of Durban and surrounding KwaZulu-Natal province. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada, from the TeleSUR studios in Caracas, Venezuela. We begin with the news. Stay with us. And now we begin. In Venezuela, the second day of the International Summit Against Fascism, as part of the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the 2002 coup d'etat, is in progress. The summit started on Monday, April 11th, with the participation of at least 200 guests from 5 continents. Participants will discuss current methods to plan a coup, as well as the reaction of the Venezuelan people, which led to the return to power of Commander Hugo Chavez after the rupture of the constitution in April 2002. They will also share their opinions on their topics, such as new forms of communication, the importance of traditional political models, the adaptation of the world to new technologies, and finally, they will share their struggle and popular resistance experience for the new times. And there are new developments in the case of the military operation in Putumayo, southwest Colombia. In a recent investigation carried out by an alliance of national media outlets in the place where 11 people were killed, new information proved the existence of a violation of humanitarian law. The operation that took place on March 28th in the community of Puerto Leguizamo left serious questions for the human rights experts consulted in investigation. The presence of unarmed civilians participating in a bazaar to raise funds to improve conditions in the area, the presence of army officers without the required uniform, and the irregularities committed in the removal of the bodies are some of the circumstances exposed by these investigations. The testimonies and the evidence gathered question the legitimacy of the operation, where, among other things, the civilians killed and wounded were labeled as guerrilla fighters without any basis whatsoever.
The surrogate mother who was with me told me. She showed me some videos that have been published that we have been posed as guerrilla, that the 4 wounded were guerrillas, and we were detained. Vanessa, are you a guerrilla member? No, I'm not a guerrilla fighter, and I do not belong to any legal armed group. It makes you angry to be called a guerrilla when you know that you are not one.
And Ecuador's Constitutional Court will address this Tuesday in an extraordinary session the President's partial veto of the law of abortion for sexual abuse issued by the National Assembly. This decision was made by a majority of 75 votes in the plenary session of the legislature because last April 5th, the governing body established 12 weeks for women over 18 years of age in urban areas and up to 18 in the case of exceptional basis in the case of girls, adolescents, and women from rural localities and indigenous communities. However, the executive considered that the term limit should be 12 weeks without distinction and established prerequisites for determination of pregnancy. And Brazil's Workers' Party filed 3 lawsuits against President Jair Bolsonaro for incitement to violence and disruption of the electoral process. The Workers' Party filed one of the lawsuits before the Public Prosecutor's Office and 2 others before the Supreme Electoral Court, demanding that adequate measures be taken to guarantee the security of this year's elections. The decision took into account statements given by the head of state in which he congratulated the people of Brazil for increasing the access of the population to firearms. The party also denounced his speech against the democratic institutions of the republic and mainly against the nation's electoral body. Workers' Party lawyers stated Bolsonaro's declarations show his willingness to disregard institutions and unleash violence in the country. And Brazil's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula Silva, began his tour in Brasilia on Tuesday and held meetings with the country's indigenous communities. The former president arrived in the capital for a 3-day talks with politicians, where he will remain until April 14th, as part of his agenda as presidential candidate of the Workers' Party for the October elections. For this reason, the former head of state visited the 18th edition of the Freeland Camp, where he held a meeting with at least 8,000 people from different indigenous communities. On the eve of this activity, indigenous communities marched against illegal mining in their territories, sponsored by the government of Jair Bolsonaro, in an act they called March Against the Garimpo. And opposition Congress members have filed a new constitutional complaint against Peruvian President Pedro Castillo for violating several articles of the Constitution as he declared a state emergency on April 5th. According to the constitutional complaint filed by Congress members from Avanza País, President Pedro Castillo repeatedly violated the Constitution and demonstrated a deplorable handling of the crisis. Likewise, Congressperson Patricia Chirinos stressed that the president must be held accountable before the Congress and requested President Castillo should be dismissed from office and disqualified politically for 10 years. The Congressperson's charges relate to the state of emergency and the curfew implemented by the president in response to protests against fuel price increases, protests that in some cases turned violent. In Mexico, social and union organizations will march this Tuesday in support of the electricity reform proposed by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Activists seek to defend the proposal of President López Obrador based on the search for greater development and modernization of the sector without having to privatize public companies. The reform also seeks to create a competitive system that will reduce energy prices, achieve higher production standards, and establish mechanisms for accountability in the industry. According to authorities, the debate on the constitutional reform was scheduled to begin this April 12th at the Chamber of Deputies. However, it was postponed to April 17th in order to achieve a greater impact at a social level. On Monday, Haiti's Prime Minister Ariel Henry expressed his unconditional support for the national police and called on officers to fight against the prevailing violence in the country. According to a statement shared from his social network, he expressed his support to the police, emphasizing their efforts to combat gangs and crime. He urged the police forces to continue their constant struggle to restore security in the country. This message comes after a scandal generated from social networks where he is accused of presenting the police as the greatest danger to the security of the country and not the 400 Mawozo gangs. In response to these rumors, the Prime Minister's office, through Twitter, again categorically denied these reports. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Welcome back to From the South. President Vladimir Putin has assured that the objectives and tasks of the operation in Ukraine will be achieved and that it was impossible to avoid a confrontation with the anti-Russian forces in that country. During his speech at the Votochanin Comdrome, he said that the objectives are to help the people in Donbas. The Russian president, together with the Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko, celebrated together the Day of Cosmonautics. When there, he stated that Kiev authorities, supported by the West, refused to comply with the Minsk agreements, which were intended to resolve the situation in the Donbas. He also said that it was impossible to continue putting up with this genocide and emphasized that the Russian troops are fighting with weapons that have no analogs in the world. Finally, he concluded that it was impossible to isolate a country of Russia's size. The President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, met on Tuesday in Vostochny, in the Russian Far East, to commemorate Cosmonautics Day and review bilateral agendas. As confirmed by Russian presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, the two leaders will tour the space launch facility and may discuss issues of future development in what Russia recognizes as one of its largest economic and high-tech projects. The leader will also discuss the situation around Ukraine and issues on the bilateral agenda. Russia celebrates cosmonautics every day, April 12th, in honor of the first manned flight out of the Earth's atmosphere by Yuri Gagarin in the Vostok 1 spacecraft. In the last 2 years, Russia has completed more than 50 space launches.
Today, in the new conditions, we are talking about continuing the cooperation on the groundwork that was made in previous decades, but passed on today's developments. I mean the creation of a new satellite for high-precision Earth sensing, the creation of joint work and plasma engines in the future that can be used. This is a very promising topic, and of course, the construction of the cosmodrome itself. We need good, competent builders. You know, it's important that I came here and don't feel sanctions here. You walk around and don't feel the sanctions. Everything is domestic. People are working. Thousands of people are working at the facility. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this construction. We will definitely accept your proposal and offer your interesting options.
And our special envoy to Ukraine, Alejandro Kirk, brings us new testimonies from the people of Mariupol, southeastern Ukraine, and what they are doing to cope with the tense situation in the country. Go ahead, Alejandro.
Temperatures have dropped today in Donbass. We are here with a group of journalists, most of them Western journalists, brought here by the Ministry of Defense of Russia to openly, for what I can see, expose the situation here. We're anyway far away from where the combat is taking place, and here is a group of people awaiting receiving humanitarian aid from the Russian forces. Journalists here are free to speak with everybody, and what most people say is they express their despair, their little hope that they have for the future. They don't know who is attacking them exactly, and this is what some of them had to say.
My parents say they don't know what to do. At the moment, we are staying with some relatives. I have a sister over 40 years old. She went to Rostov. She left. My opinion is that we should come to an agreement, and that's it, especially those on top of both sides.
The
situation yesterday and today is that the city is simply closed by a military order that I cannot and I have no right to comment yet. But you see in front of us a large humanitarian center, which on normal days serves at least 2,000 or 3,000 people every day. It concentrates both warehouses with foodstuffs and trading services. Volunteers are working, pushing up to the front line, catering people sheltered in the basements, those who are walking as well. All this information has very well been collected and has very well been processed.
That's it from Mariupol, Donbass.
We thank our special envoy Alejandro Kirk, who is there in Mariupol, in the Donbas region in Ukraine, reporting for us in the field. Now we move on. The U.S. government warns that the inflation data to be released this Tuesday will be extraordinarily high. Once more, the responsibility lies outside the Biden administration. This time, the Kremlin is to blame. despite the fact that the numbers have been soaring since November 2021, when the consumer price index, the CPI, exceeded 7.5%, and that in February maintained the trend. Washington has blamed Russia for this, forgetting that President Joe Biden assured that the measures imposed against the Eurasian nation will not affect them because they had taken the necessary measures and precautions. Experts assure that the Biden's Democratic government is visibly nervous regarding the electoral cost of the historic price increase could have in the November's legislative elections. The White House spokesperson Jen Psaki has gone a step further and has directly held the president of another country, Vladimir Putin, responsible for the situation.
We expect March CPI headline inflation to be extraordinarily elevated due to Putin's price hike. And we expect a large difference between core and headline inflation, reflecting the global disruptions in energy and food markets.
And for all the success of the United States-led campaign to isolate Russia on the world stage, India has stood out as one major democracy that has been reluctant to criticize Vladimir Putin, and it is unlikely to change anytime soon. During an hour-long video call between U.S. President Joe Biden, senior officials, and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the leaders expressed growing alarm over the destruction caused in the framework of the conflict in Ukraine. India's neutral stance in the conflict has raised concerns in Washington and earned praise from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who lauded India for judging the situation in its entirety, not just in a one-sided way. While the meeting was described by U.S. officials as a warm and candid, U.S. head of state urged Indian Prime Minister to not accelerate the purchase of Russian oil, as several Western allies look to cut off Moscow's energy income. And the Organization of Oil Exporting Countries, OPEC+, warned the European Union that the sanctions imposed against Russia, current and future, could give way to one of the worst oil supply crises in history. This Monday, representatives of the European Union met in Vienna with representatives of the world's largest oil alliance to negotiate an increase in production to compensate for the Russian deficit. They also requested sanctions against Moscow. Some representatives of the European Union insinuated that OPEC could have some responsibility in the crisis. OPEC Secretary General Mohamed Burkindo rejected such allegations, saying that more than 7 million barrels of Russian oil per day could be lost, as well as other exports. Burkindo said that it will be almost impossible to compensate for a loss of such high volumes. OPEC rejected the request made by the United States and the International Energy Agency to increase pumping of crude oil in order to bring prices down. And we have more news coming up after a final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back from the south. At least 45 people have died in floods and mudslides after rainstorms struck the South African port city of Durban and surrounding KwaZulu-Natal province. The province's Department of Cooperative Governance announced in a statement that the death toll could possibly increase as more reports come in. Days of pounding rain flooded several areas and shut dozens of roads across the southeastern city, while landslides caused train services across KwaZulu-Natal to be suspended. The Disaster Management Department in the KwaZulu-Natal province urged people to stay at home and ordered those residing in low-lying areas to move to higher ground. According to Provincial Premier Shile Zigala, more than 2,000 houses and 4,000 informal homes have been damaged. Rescue operations, aided by the military, are underway to evacuate people trapped in affected areas. And rescuers, hampered by mud and rain on Tuesday, used their bare hands and shovels to search for survivors and landslides that smashed into villages in the central Philippines as the death toll from Tropical Storm Maggie rose to 42. Tens of thousands fled their homes as the storm hit the disaster-prone region in recent days, bringing heavy rain that flooded houses, cut roads, and knocked out power. At least 36 people died and 27 were missing after landslides slammed into multiple villages around Bye Bye City in Leyte province, the hardest hit by the storm. Rescue efforts continue under the cover of nightfall Tuesday in Leyte province's Pilar village, after an avalanche of mud and earth pushed 80% of the houses of about 400 residents into the sea. It is supposed to be the dry season, but maybe climate change has upended that, said Marisa Miguel Cano, the public information officer from Bay City. Cano also said that the hilly region of corn, rice, and coconut farms was prone to landslides, but they were usually small and not fatal. A dust storm has swept through much of Iraq, has left dozens of people in hospital with respiratory problems, a health ministry spokesperson confirmed on Tuesday. The storm erupted in the north of the country on Thursday, prompting the cancellation of flights serving Erbil, the capital of the autonomous Kurdistan region. As the storm swept through south, it surrounded Baghdad and cities as far south as Nasiriyah in a ghastly orange. In the capital, buildings and vehicles were covered in ochre-colored dust. The director of Iraq's meteorological office said that while dust storms were not uncommon in the country, they are becoming more frequent due to drought, desertification, and declining rainfall. Iraq is particularly vulnerable to climate change, having already witnessed record low rainfall and high temperatures in recent years. And Pakistan's new Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is taking steps to revive the country's economy. On his first day in office, Pakistan's premier abolished 2 days off per week in government offices and also modified working hours in a bid to strengthen the national economy. Sharif was elected by parliament as Prime Minister on Monday to replace Imran Khan, who was ousted after facing a no-confidence motion. Sharif is expected to remain in office until 2023, when general elections are scheduled. And protesters marched and chanted anti-government slogans in the streets of Colombo on Tuesday, on the same day that Sri Lanka said it is suspending its repayment of foreign debt. Sri Lanka is halting debt repayment, including bonds and government-to-government borrowings, pending the completion of a loan restructuring program with the International Monetary Fund to deal with the island's nation's worst economic crisis in decades. Sri Lankans for the past month have been enduring shortages of fuel, food, and other essential and daily power outages. Most of those items are paid for in hard currency, but Sri Lanka is on the brink of bankruptcy, saddled with dwindling foreign reserves and $25 billion in foreign debt. Much of the anger expressed in weeks of protests have been directed at the Rajapaksa family, including the president and prime minister, who have been in power for most of the past 2 decades.
We've been depending on them for too long. It's been 74 years, right, ever since the British left us. And look where we are right now. Today we declare that we are defaulting our bank for in debt. So we have got to the rock bottom. We are going to restructure our entire loans. So that means there is no other place we could fall here up. We have got to the rock bottom. So why, like, this is the perfect opportunity to reset everything, like reset Sri Lanka, to start rebuilding.
Now we address other topics. Peru began the latest stage of its COVID-19 vaccination campaign, offering a second booster dose, the fourth in its entirety, to its health workers. The aim is to reduce the risk of infection for medical professionals, since their work puts them in a direct contact with patients. According to the Executive Director of Immunizations of the Peruvian Ministry of Health, Maria Martinez, the fourth dose will also be for those who are over the age of 70 or have weakened immune systems. The latest round of vaccinations at centers around the Lima metropolitan area will continue until April 13th. Peru has had more than 3.5 million cases of coronavirus infections, with more than 200,000 deaths related to COVID-19, according to the Johns Hopkins University tally of cases worldwide.
I thank the Ministry of Health for today, for having the 4 doses applied to health personnel, especially to the doctors. I received the 4th dose a few minutes ago without any problems. I'm very happy for it and very grateful to God for this blessing.
I think it is very good that there is a 4th dose to protect us at this level of the pandemic. This helps us a lot to strengthen our immune system and also protect us from any disease, especially COVID-19.
And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media for all the latest news. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.